Hello and welcome to the video presentation for module number 8. In this video we're going to be talking about pentatonic scales and also what are called synthetic scales, which sounds pretty cool. So we'll work on defining the terms pentatonic scale and synthetic scale. We'll work on how to identify and construct 3 common pentatonic scales and recognize the modes of these scales. And then finally, we'll do the same for the various synthetic scales. Okay, so remember, these are all techniques that the book presents as being used commonly by what's called post-tonal composers, right? Basically it's a bunch of scales. And they get used by various composers at various times. And the whole point of them is to create music that is outside of the traditional major-minor system, or major-minor scales specifically. So that's really kind of why the book presents it in this final chapter. But that doesn't mean that they're only used in contemporary classical music, right? They exist everywhere. So the broadest definition of what a pentatonic scale is simply any scale that divides the octave into 5 notes. So we're used to scales that, well, we've been dealing with scales that divide the octave into 7 parts, right? Plus the octave. A pentatonic scale will take that same octave, but divide it into 5 different parts. Okay, so dividing the octave into 5 tones. Now, of course, that means that there are an infinite number of different pentatonic scales, because you can divide the octave in a lot of different ways. But the 3 most commonly used pentatonic scales are the major pentatonic scale, the minor pentatonic scale, and apparently the Hirajoshi scale, which I really don't know much about, but the book does talk about it, so we'll kind of go over it. And the first 2 have one important thing in common, which is that the scales have no half steps between any of the notes. So that's critical because, what defines a scale as either major or minor is its construction of whole steps and half steps. And so these major and minor pentatonic scales are a lot more flexible in terms of the context that they can be used in, the harmonic context they can be used in, because they don't have any half steps between the notes. And we'll see that in a second. So let's start with the major pentatonic scale. Major pentatonic scales have 5 notes, and like I said, no half steps between any of the notes. So this is an F major pentatonic scale. And it's equivalent to a major scale that's missing the 4. So if this were an F major scale, we'd expect there to be a B flat there. And A to B flat would be that half step, but it's missing, so instead we have a 3rd. And we'd also expect there to be an E there, right? But it's missing, so instead we have a 3rd. So we end up with this scale that has sort of, I don't want to say neutral, but I mean kind of a nondescript feeling, right? So the half steps really define the quality of a scale, whether it's major or minor, Lydian, whatever, right? The sound of the scale. And since this doesn't have any, it does have a characteristic sound, but it's something that can be used to kind of fit into a lot of different situations. So without those half steps, it becomes a very flexible sound. Okay. And just like you can make modes out of the diatonic scale, you can also make modes out of the pentatonic scale. You can do it with any scale, really. So if we go back to our F major pentatonic scale, we can start on any one of those scale steps and create a mode of pentatonic F major in this case. So if we started a scale on the note G of this pentatonic scale, we'd end up with what's called the second mode, or mode 2 of F major pentatonic. And this is universal. You can do this with anything. Like we could have called Dorian mode 2, and it is. This is just kind of a universal name for it. So that sounds like this. Right? Actually kind of a distinct sound from our... Right? So interesting. They kind of create... They have their own unique qualities, just like the modes of diatonic scales too. So pretty cool. Now, if we did we could do it on any of those notes, and I won't go over all of them, but we do have an important one that starts on the 5th note of the scale. So this would be mode 5, and it sounds like this. So mode 5. And mode 5 is what we call the minor pentatonic scale. Okay? And you can, again, you see there's no half steps in this. It's all whole steps or thirds, right? And if you wanted to compare it to a minor scale, which I guess has some value, you'd see that between the D and the F is missing the E, right? So the 2nd degree of a minor scale is missing. And also the 5th degree of the scale, 6th degree of the scale, the B flat is also missing from this, okay? So those two are missing. You can look at it that way. But I think a much more helpful way to look at this, to think about it quickly, is that this minor pentatonic scale, right? I'm sorry, that's a little error there. That should say D minor pentatonic. This D minor pentatonic scale starts on D, which is the relative minor of the note F. So just like the scale of F major is related to the scale of D minor being relative, I think the quickest way to think about the relationship between major and minor pentatonic is that they are related by a relative relationship, right? So they are related just like F and D are relatives. So F major pentatonic and D minor pentatonic are also relative keys, relative scales, I guess. Okay, so let's talk about this Hirajoshi scale. And it's a pentatonic scale, but it's a case of pentatonic where there are half steps between the notes. And I'll kind of play it. It has a half step between its 2nd and 3rd degrees, and also a half step between its 4th and 5th degrees. Yeah, and to our ears, it does sound pretty, well, frankly, kind of foreign to our ears, right? Because we don't normally hear music with that mode. So pretty interesting sound. Let me play that one more time. Yeah, pretty cool. I like that one. All right. And like I said, there's a half step there between 2 and 3, and a half step there between 4 and 5. And notice we're numbering the notes that exist, right? And this actually kind of leads me to what we're going to talk about with synthetic scales, and that if we think about that staff, right? The staff lines, it's really set up for diatonic scales, right? Scales that have 7 scale degrees. But there's no reason, right? If we lived in a culture that only used a pentatonic scale, and we also had a staff, right? A music notation system, and we didn't use diatonic scales, it would actually kind of make sense that our staff would be set up to do a pentatonic scale, right? And not a diatonic scale. So we wouldn't have that space in there, right? So maybe that F, G, A, and B, right? There's no reason why that couldn't sound like, right? So just because it looks like we're skipping a note in our system, in other cultures, we're not necessarily doing that, right? And in fact, the other way is true too. There are a lot of other music cultures that divide the scale into more than 7 parts, right? And even further than that, they divide the scale in more than, in a smaller degree than just a half step. So they have notation systems that are developed to show you where like quarter tones and half tones are, things like that. So worth thinking about. I think my point with that is it looks weird on our staff, but that's just because our staff isn't really equipped to handle this kind of music. And it's going to get even worse now because we're going to talk about synthetic scales. And the synthetic scale, these are what the book calls pitch collections. We can just call them scales that have little or no connection to our diatonic scale system. Okay? And I guess they're called synthetic because the idea is that they don't arise naturally in a music culture, maybe, but that is not really true because I think there are, the possibilities of music are endless. So I'm sure you can find instances of this being in the folk music of some other tradition, right? So just because it doesn't exist in Western European music doesn't mean it doesn't exist anywhere else. So, but if we're looking at it this way, which is fine, we'll just say that there really are an infinite number of synthetic scales because these are just something that are constructed by a composer, right? So we've basically made up a new scale. So there's a lot of different possibilities, but we'll look at some of the common ones that happen. One will be the whole tone scale. One is the octatonic scale. Another is called the hexatonic scale. And finally, we'll look at what's called hybrid scales. Okay, so whole tone scale is exactly what it sounds like. It's a scale that divides the octave into 6 whole steps. Okay, so normally we, a pentatonic scale doesn't have half steps, but it also has thirds and stuff like that. A whole tone scale doesn't have half steps, but every single tone is separated by a whole step from every other tone. So it kind of sounds like this. We have F to G as a whole step, G to A as a whole step, then another whole step to B, then another whole step to C sharp, another whole step to E flat / D sharp, and then another whole step to F. Right? Pretty sweet. Now you can see our staff here doesn't like this at all, right? So I had to write a C sharp and an E flat in order to make it work on our system, right? I could have written a D sharp and that would have looked equally bad because it's not a step between D sharp and F. So you can see that these synthetic scales, because they are not really diatonic, just like our pentatonics and stuff like that, right? They don't really like to work with our staff, but we're just kind of making them work with the staff, right? By some creative accidentals. So this is a whole tone scale. Now, it's only possible to transpose this scale up by 1/2 step before you end up with the same pitch collection as one of the other whole tone scales, right? So what we had here has the notes F, G, A, B natural, C sharp, E flat, and F. We could transpose this up by a 1/2 step so that it starts on F sharp, and we'd end up with F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, C, D, E, and F sharp again. And if we transpose it one more time so that it starts on G, we end up with G, A, B natural, C sharp, E flat, F, G, which is the exact same notes as what we have in front of us. So I was only able to transpose this up by 1/2 step before it repeated, before I didn't get a new collection of notes anymore. Okay, so we'll look at something like this. We'll look at this more extensively later, but this is called a mode of limited transposition, which means that there's a limit to how many times you can transpose it before you stop getting new stuff, before you stop getting new notes. Okay, and this is one of them. Another thing to note is that it's also symmetrical, right? So you could start on any note in the scale and it might be the tonic, right? There's no half steps or whole steps that really define something as a tonic, right? So there's no leading tone, right? There's nothing it's nothing asymmetrical that would define a certain tone as having a different relationship with the other ones, right? It's symmetrical, so all the tones are related to all the other tones in the exact same way. All right, and that's true with a lot of synthetic scales. Let's look at the next one, the octatonic scale, the coolest sounding scale for sure. And like the name suggests, it's an 8-note scale, and the way it's constructed, one way of thinking about the construction is that it alternates whole steps and half steps as it goes up the scale. So again, our notation system reveals itself as useless when trying to notate something like this clearly, right? But you can see that this alternates half steps and whole steps and creates an 8-note scale from F to F. So if we have a F to G whole step, that will be followed by a G to A flat half step, then a A flat, B flat whole step, and then we have half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Yeah, pretty awesome. Okay. So there are actually two different versions of this because, like I said, it alternates whole steps, half steps, but it can also start with a half step and then go to a whole step. So you can either have a version of octatonic that starts with a whole step or a version of octatonic that starts with a half step, right? So the other version sounds like this. Yeah. And this is a pretty versatile scale. It's actually used in jazz improvisation because it works really well over a over a fully diminished seventh chord, and it works over a lot of altered chords and things like that that have parts of the chord that are like a fully diminished seventh chord. So very tense kind of scale, right? Actually, it's very closely related to a fully diminished seventh chord in its construction. All right, but there are two versions. One starts with a whole step, one starts with a half step, and you build the scale by alternating whole steps and half steps until you get back to the octave. Okay. Now, another one is the hexatonic scale, and like the name suggests, it's a 6-note scale. And this one will alternate half steps and minor thirds. So if we start this hexatonic scale on an F, we end up with something like this. All right, which is pretty strange, but interesting. So F to F sharp's a half step, F sharp to A is a minor third, A to A sharp's a half step, A to C sharp is a minor third, C sharp to D is a half step, D to F is a minor third. There you go. Okay. And then that brings us to our last sort of or type of scale, which is called a hybrid scale. And the book presents this as just scales that are created by combining the first half of one scale with the second half of another scale, right? And specifically, they do this with modes. I guess it's conceivable to do this with any kind of scale, right? But we're going to just kind of treat it like the book does. So this is combining two different modes to create a new scale, right? So the example we have here is something called Lydian Mixolydian, which is kind of a mouthful. So people who use this, which are mostly jazz players, they'll call it a Lydian dominant scale because you can use it over a dominant chord because of its characteristics. And you'll see that the first 4 notes here are F, G, A, B natural, which is like an F major scale with a sharped 4, which is why this is called Lydian first. And then the second half of the scale is C, D, E flat, F, which is like the second half of a major scale with a lowered 7th. So it's like Mixolydian, right? So it sounds like this. Right? This is used for improvisation over a dominant chord as well, right? Because it has that, I guess over an altered dominant, because it has that altered B natural in the scale. Okay. All right, so there you go. Hybrid scales combining the first half of one scale with the second half of the other. So let's look at some examples, because you can start these scales on any note. You're not limited to just the note F like I was doing. Okay. So here we have, it's asking for E major pentatonic. So a good place to start would be on the note E. So we'll write our E here. Okay. Now I know that this is going to be just like a major scale, but missing its 4th and its 7th degree. So I can start on E. My next note would be F sharp, just like E major. My next note would be G sharp, just like E major. Skip the A, don't need it. My 5th note in E major is a B. My next note in E major is C sharp. Skip my 7th, don't need it. And I end up on my E again. So there is my E major pentatonic scale. All right, check. Okay, a G whole tone scale. Whole tone scales are, every tone is separated by a whole tone from all the other tones. So start on a G this time. Now this will be the same notes as actually the example we had, even though that one started on F, because you can't transpose it more than once. So we have a G, an A, that's a whole step, an A to a B is a whole step, A B to a C sharp is a whole step. A C sharp to a D sharp is a whole step. And then you have to make a decision. How much do you hate your life? You could do E sharp if you really wanted to make it a step, but I don't want to do that. So I'm going to make it an F natural. And then I'm going to end this on a G, right? So you always end up with something kind of funky because our system, right, does not really work too well with this concept. So you just kind of have to accept that it's not going to look like a scale, but it does sound like a scale if you play it. All right. Okay, then we have a synthetic scale here, D Lydian Mixolydian. So that means we're going to have the sharp 4 of Lydian, or the raised 4, and the lowered 7th degree of Mixolydian. And we'll start on D, so we'll have D, E, F sharp, that is unchanged from D major. Then we want to have our 4th degree be raised. It should be a G natural in D major, but in Lydian, that's a G sharp. Then we have our 5th degree A, then our 6th degree B, and then we have our lowered 7th degree. It should be a C sharp, right, in the key of D major, but we need to lower that by a half step, so I'll put a courtesy C natural there, and then end on D. So there's our D Lydian Mixolydian scale, also known as D Lydian dominant. Okay, and then finally, our last synthetic scale here, the A octatonic, and it says start with whole step first. So start on the note A, and we're just going to alternate half steps and whole steps until we get to the end, starting with a whole step. So A to B natural is a whole step. B natural to C natural is a half step. Now, I always get kind of lost in this, so I might even just mark this. So I'll say 1 and then half. All right, then I want to be follow that with a whole step. Follow this with a half step. It's kind of marking. Follow that by a whole step. Follow this by a half step. I think I'll make it a... Let's make it an F sharp. Again, let's make decisions here. It could be G flat as well. Follow that by a whole step, G sharp, and then follow that by a half step. And if you don't end up on the right note that you started on, you did something wrong, but I did it right for once here. So there's our A octatonic scale. Great stuff. All right, cool. There you go. So some interesting scales. Hope you enjoyed all the scales, and we'll talk about it more in our live Zoom session. And thanks for watching. Have a great day.